Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, as a founding member of the United Nations, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela is a firm defender of the purposes and principles enshrined in the founding charter of our organization, as well as in norms of international law. Mr. President, the situation in Ukraine has been broadly debated in recent years. In addressing this matter, our country, faithful to our diplomacy of peace, has called for a peaceful settlement of any dispute which might exist in the Eastern European region. In that spirit, in 2015, as a non-permanent member of the Security Council, we voted in favor of Resolution 2202, the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements. In that year, we built a diplomatic path agreed to by everyone to find a peaceful solution to the civil war in Ukraine. However, and sadly, these agreements were wasted after 7 years of violations within Ukraine, which widened the national divide and increased the suffering of the civilian population. The violent domestic crisis was heightened by another factor, the growing outside pressure of the NATO military bloc towards Ukraine itself, with the destructive effect of security assurances for all, in particular for the Russian Federation, and which are the basis for security architecture in Europe. The steady expansion of NATO towards Eastern Europe has added a further threat, strategic in nature, to the national crisis in Ukraine. Today we are seeing a crisis at 3 levels with regrettable loss of human life, and the developments on the ground are changing at a high rate of speed. What arose as a violent national divide in Ukraine has escalated into an international military crisis. Currently, less than a week since the onset of the conflict, we are heading dangerously towards a 3rd level. That is an escalation between 4 nuclear powers, which, in changing their strategic security balances and attempting to destabilize one of them through an economic blockade, in this case the Russian Federation, could lead to the unleashing of a conflict of global proportions. This situation has no precedent in our history since the Second World War. Mr. President, in the current circumstances in Eastern Europe, security is a value which must prevail for all parties involved. The United Nations was established after the greatest war in history to guarantee the maintenance of international peace and security. Its greatest success has been avoiding a 3rd World War. And even when it's not been possible to avoid armed conflict, the role of our organization through political negotiation has been to reverse conflict and to return to diplomacy for a peaceful resolution. And that is our duty today, to correct our path and to avoid going into a point of no return which will compromise the survival of present and future generations. We must work towards ending an escalation of tensions. Our role today is not to fuel tensions and divides at all 3 levels that I referred to, at the national, regional, and global level. The United Nations cannot be used to further fuel conflicts. We emphasize the fact that this is the only institution in the world with the capacity, the experience, and the instruments required to achieve a peaceful settlement of disputes of the magnitude we are witnessing today. There is a growing threat of a global conflict between nuclear powers. Because of all of this, and in order to get out of this labyrinth we are in today, we appeal to this General Assembly and to responsible members of the international community to address this crisis at 3 levels in a balanced fashion and very cautiously, so that we avoid furthering divisions. We therefore reject the implementation of unilateral and retaliatory coercive measures for economic, commercial, or financial purposes because they will intensify the crisis and prolong the conflict. While mankind continues to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, a new global economic crisis is being imposed by design for the express purpose of generating suffering for hundreds of millions of people worldwide, a deliberately generated crisis in order to destabilize a nuclear power. This is not the path to peace. Mr. President, the principle of indivisible security presupposes that the security of one country cannot sacrifice the security of others, and military blocs such as NATO cannot expand indefinitely, threatening the security of other regions of the planet. It is therefore necessary to begin direct negotiations allowing for prompt, peaceful, comprehensive, and lasting resolution of the current circumstances at all three levels, and where the concerns of all parties concerned are taken into account. Political dialogue between Russia and Ukraine. And on that point, we welcome the recent contacts in Belarus, and on the other, direct talks on an equal footing between Russia and NATO, which will allow for the building of an effective, balanced, and sustainable mechanism for European security. In conclusion, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela reiterates its unwavering commitment to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. From this rostrum, we appeal for an end to war propaganda and to speeches of intolerance guided by ideologies of hate, and we emphasize that only through diplomacy, dialogue, and restraint, without pressure or sanctions, can we establish a necessary ceasefire at all three levels of the crisis in Ukraine and avoid a chain reaction which will lead us walking mindlessly into the abyss. Thank you. Avoid a chain reaction which will lead us walking.
We were watching and listening live statements of Cuban representatives to the UN regarding the situation in Ukraine. The Cuban official lamented the violent situation that escalated to an international crisis, also the loss of lives. He also condemned the situation of the role of the US and the Western powers in it. Also, he said this is an unprecedented situation and also that could cause irreversible effects, and stressed that the right path is diplomacy and dialogue. The Cuban diplomat also stressed the United Nations has the capacity to cope, deal, and end the violent escalation if it follows cautiously its own principles. Cuba's representative said there are backstage moves and economic interest in this escalation, and also being the US and NATO the masterminds of it. He recalled recent attempts of dialogue in Belarus and acknowledged them as a genesis of the possible solution to the crisis, and he also called for an end to the smear campaigns and anti-Russia propaganda. teleSUR English will provide you with more details. Stay with us.